Of all the places someone could expect peace, a funeral should be at the top of the list. A time of reflection, grief, and respect. But what happens when something so sacred is shattered by an act so shocking it leaves everyone speechless? Today's story is one that has left a permanent mark on the lives of many, a story of injustice, bravery, and accountability that has taken the internet and the justice system by storm. This isn't just another headline. It's a moment in history that people will talk about for years to come. Imagine this: a quiet funeral service, the somber sound of footsteps, the faint rustling of flowers, and the muffled cries of loved ones saying their final goodbyes. This was supposed to be a day of mourning for a distinguished military general, a man who dedicated his life to serving his country. The air was heavy with respect and sorrow, and everyone gathered to honor the memory of a hero. But then, without warning, the atmosphere shifted. In walked a police officer, one who many would later describe as arrogant and volatile, his every move seemingly charged with unwarranted authority. He wasn't there to pay respects. He wasn't there to ensure safety. His presence was an interruption, and it didn't take long for things to escalate in the most unimaginable way. This officer, known for a troubling history of abuse of power, did something so egregious that it sent shockwaves through the community. As the ceremony unfolded, he pointed his firearm at the grieving family, and at the late general's son, a man in full military uniform who had served with the same honor and dignity as his father. The funeral turned into chaos. Families screamed, children cried, and the sacred space was transformed into a scene of confusion and fear. But the story doesn't end there. What makes this even more heart-wrenching is the reason behind his actions. Witnesses would later testify that this wasn't about enforcing the law or dealing with a threat. This was about something far darker, an act motivated by prejudice, one that had no place in any society, let alone in a moment meant to honor a fallen hero. As we peel back the layers of this story, you'll hear about the people who stood up in that moment, risking their own safety to protect others. You'll learn about the bravery of those who refused to let this injustice go unanswered. And most importantly, you'll see how a community came together to demand accountability and ensure that this officer's badge would no longer shield him from the consequences of his actions. The court case that followed was explosive. The officer's actions were dissected in painstaking detail, and his history as a law enforcement officer was brought to light. And while many feared that justice would be just another distant dream, the sentence that came down was a groundbreaking moment, a sentence that sent a clear message about abuse of power and accountability. This story is more than just about one officer's downfall. It's a wake-up call, a reminder of what happens when the very people sworn to protect us betray that trust. It's about a family's courage in the face of unimaginable pain and a community that refused to stay silent. Most importantly, it's about the fight for justice and the resilience of those who believe that no one, no matter their position or power, is above the law. So, what led to this life-changing sentence? What evidence was so damning that the court had no choice but to act decisively? And what does this mean for the broader conversation about policing and accountability in our society? The answers will leave you both outraged and hopeful, and they're coming up in the next part of this story. Don't go anywhere. This is a story you won't want to miss. The events that unfolded at the funeral were like something out of a nightmare, a moment that no one could have predicted or prepared for. But as the dust began to settle and the initial shock wore off, the community was left asking one burning question: why? What could have driven a law enforcement officer to commit such a blatant act of aggression at a place so sacred and symbolic? The answers were slow to emerge, but when they did, they painted a picture of a man whose actions were not just reckless, but deeply rooted in something far more sinister. The officer in question, whose name we'll withhold for now, was not new to controversy. In fact, his record revealed a troubling history of complaints, many of which involved excessive force, racial profiling, and a blatant disregard for the very laws he was sworn to uphold. Yet, like too many stories we've heard before, those complaints seem to have been swept under the rug. Time and time again, he was allowed to wear the badge, with little more than a slap on the wrist to show for his misconduct. It was a pattern that had gone unchecked for years until the day of the funeral. The day itself began like any other. The family of the late general had gathered early to prepare for the ceremony, leaning on one another for support as they braced themselves for an emotional farewell. The general's son, a man of quiet strength, had taken it upon himself to organize much of the service, ensuring that his father's legacy would be honored with the dignity it deserved. He was dressed in full military regalia, a testament to the values his father had instilled in him: discipline, honor, and respect. But even as the family arrived at the cemetery, there were murmurs of something unusual. Witnesses later recalled seeing the officer patrolling the area, his presence unexplained and his demeanor unsettling. He wasn't part of the security detail, and no one had called for his assistance. Still, he lingered on the outskirts, watching. At the time, no one thought much of it. After all, a police officer at a public event isn't entirely out of the ordinary. But looking back, many would later describe the way he observed the family as unnerving, almost predatory. As the ceremony began, everything seemed to proceed as planned. Tributes were made, tears were shed, and the general's legacy was remembered with love and pride. But then, just as the final words were being spoken, the officer made his move. Striding toward the family with purpose, he interrupted the solemn moment with a tone that was both aggressive and accusatory. Witnesses described the tension escalating almost immediately. The general's son, standing tall in his uniform, tried to de-escalate the situation, speaking calmly and respectfully. But the officer's hostility only grew. It was then that he drew his weapon, pointing it directly at the son's chest. The sight of a gun at a funeral, aimed at a grieving family member, sent waves of panic through the crowd. Children screamed, elderly guests were rushed to safety, and chaos erupted in an instant. The reasons the officer gave for his actions were vague and inconsistent. Initially, he claimed to have been investigating a threat, though no evidence of such a threat ever surfaced. Others who knew him suggested a darker motive, one rooted in bias and prejudice. The general's family, a prominent black military family, had been subjected to subtle forms of discrimination before, but no one could have imagined it would escalate to this level. As investigators began piecing together the events of that day, more troubling details came to light. The officer's personal social media accounts were combed through, revealing a pattern of posts that raised serious red flags. Comments that were inflammatory, divisive, and, at times, outright racist painted a picture of a man whose beliefs may have influenced his actions more than anyone initially realized. His colleagues, when questioned, provided mixed responses. Some defended him, calling him a dedicated officer. But others admitted they had seen warning signs long before this incident, signs that had been ignored or dismissed by the very system that was supposed to hold him accountable. The general's son, meanwhile, became a symbol of resilience in the face of adversity. Though visibly shaken by the events, he refused to let his father's memory be overshadowed by what had happened. He spoke out, not just for his family, but for all those who have been victims of abuse of power. "This isn't just about us," he said in a statement to the press. "It's about making sure this never happens to anyone else. It's about accountability, justice, and the kind of future we want for the next generation." The community rallied behind him, organizing protests and vigils that called for the officer to be held accountable. The funeral may have ended in chaos, but it sparked a movement that brought people together in ways no one could have anticipated. Signs bearing messages of unity and justice filled the streets, and social media lit up with calls for reform. Yet, even as the community came together, the process of seeking justice was anything but straightforward. The legal system, often criticized for its slow pace, seemed to drag its feet in the face of overwhelming evidence. The officer was placed on administrative leave, but many feared it would end there: a quiet suspension, a transfer to another department, and then business as usual. After all, how many times have we seen that same story play out before? But this time was different. This time, the outcry was too loud to ignore. Activists, lawyers, and ordinary citizens worked tirelessly to ensure that the officer's actions would not be forgotten. Every piece of evidence, every witness testimony, every detail of his troubled history was brought to light, piece by painful piece. The trial that followed would become one of the most closely watched cases in recent memory, a battle not just for justice, but for the very soul of a community. Still, there was no telling how it would end. The officer's defense team mounted an aggressive case, attempting to shift blame and cast doubt on the motives of the general's family. The courtroom became a battleground, with emotions running high on both sides. And while the community waited with bated breath for the outcome, one question lingered. Would justice truly be served? Or would this become yet another example of the system failing those it was meant to protect? As the trial moved forward, new revelations continued to emerge, each one more shocking than the last. What began as a single act of violence at a funeral had grown into a much larger story, one that touched on systemic issues far beyond the actions of one man. And yet, even as the truth came to light, the ultimate resolution remained uncertain. What would the jury decide? Would the officer face the consequences of his actions, or would he walk away unscathed? The answers to those questions were still to come, but one thing was clear: this story was far from over. The tension, the mystery, the fight for accountability. It was all building to a moment that no one would soon forget. Stay tuned, because the next part of this story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice, power, and the courage it takes to stand up for what's right. As the courtroom doors opened each morning, the tension in the air was palpable. The trial had become the center of national attention, with journalists, activists, and everyday citizens filling the gallery or tuning in from afar. This was no longer just a case about a rogue officer. It had grown into a symbol of a much larger issue, one that forced people to confront the uncomfortable truths about power, accountability, and prejudice. Each day brought new testimonies, and with them, a deeper dive into the tangled web of events that led to that fateful moment at the funeral. The prosecution wasted no time presenting the damning evidence. They began with the officer's past, painting a clear picture of a man who had long abused the power of his badge. There were records of traffic stops that disproportionately targeted minorities, complaints from community members about unnecessary aggression, and even internal memos warning about his behavior. Yet, nothing had been done. A former colleague took the stand and testified about how the officer had often joked about his authority, saying things like, "Who's going to believe them over me?" That simple sentence hung in the air like a dark cloud, a chilling reminder of how the system had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. But it wasn't just his professional record that came under scrutiny. The officer's personal life was examined as well. Social media posts were displayed for the jury, revealing a troubling pattern of rhetoric that many found deeply unsettling. Some posts were laced with inflammatory language, while others shared images that hinted at extremist beliefs. Defense attorneys tried to argue that these posts were taken out of context, but the prosecution countered by showing how these attitudes could influence his decisions on the job. A person's beliefs don't stay locked in their private life, the prosecutor said, their voice steady but firm. They spill over into their actions, especially when that person holds a position of power. The defense, meanwhile, tried to shift the narrative. They claimed that the officer had acted out of caution, that he believed there was a legitimate threat at the funeral. They pointed to his years of service, arguing that he had made a split-second decision under difficult circumstances. But as the prosecution played footage from the body cameras of other officers present that day, the jury saw a different story. The video showed the calm demeanor of the general's son, standing unarmed and composed, even as a gun was pointed at him. It showed the fear in the eyes of the mourners, the chaos that unfolded not because of a threat, but because of the officer's actions. The general's son, now the face of a movement, took the stand himself. His testimony was calm and measured, but every word carried the weight of his experience. He spoke about his father, the sacrifices he had made for his country, and the values he had passed down to his family. He described the moment the gun was drawn, how he had tried to reason with the officer, and how he had felt not fear for himself, but for the others in the crowd. "I wasn't worried about me," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I was worried about the mothers holding their children, the elderly who couldn't run. I was worried about the people who came to honor my father and left with a memory of terror instead." His words struck a chord with everyone in the room. Even those who had tried to view the case objectively couldn't ignore the humanity in his story. Here was a man who had devoted his life to the same principles his father had: service, honor, and respect, now forced to defend his own dignity against an act of blatant aggression. His testimony was followed by that of other witnesses, each one adding another layer to the story. There were people who had seen the officer's behavior that day, who described his tone, his body language, and the way he seemed to escalate the situation without cause. Each account was like a puzzle piece, coming together to form a picture that was impossible to ignore. Outside the courtroom, the community continued to rally. Protesters lined the streets, their signs calling for justice and reform. But there was tension there too, as not everyone saw the case the same way. Some defended the officer, claiming he was being unfairly vilified. Others questioned why it had taken such an extreme incident to bring attention to his behavior when there had been warning signs for years. It was a conversation that spilled into town halls, social media feeds, and dinner tables, forcing people to confront their own beliefs about authority and accountability. Meanwhile, the officer himself sat in silence throughout much of the trial. His face was unreadable, but his defense team was anything but passive. They tried to pick apart the testimonies, questioning the reliability of witnesses and suggesting that the public outcry had biased the jury. But as more and more evidence piled up, their arguments seemed to falter. The prosecution revealed that the officer had ignored multiple protocols that day, acting not as a protector, but as a provocateur. They showed how his actions were not just a mistake, but a deliberate choice, one rooted in prejudice and fueled by a sense of untouchable power. As the trial dragged on, new questions began to emerge. Why had the officer been allowed to stay on the force despite his history? Who had ignored the complaints? And what responsibility did they bear for what happened? These questions added another layer of complexity to an already charged case, turning it into not just a trial of one man, but a reckoning for an entire system. The general's family, though united in their quest for justice, faced their own struggles. The media attention was relentless, with reporters camped outside their home and pundits dissecting their every move. Yet they remained steadfast, refusing to let the narrative shift away from what truly mattered. They weren't just fighting for their father's legacy, they were fighting for every family that had ever been victimized by those who should have protected them. And still the ultimate question loomed: would justice be served? The jury's decision would not only determine the officer's fate, but also send a message about the value of accountability in a society that too often allows those in power to escape consequence. The tension grew with each passing day, the weight of the case pressing down on everyone involved. But even as the trial neared its conclusion, one thing remained clear: this story was far from over. The truth had been laid bare, but the fight for justice was still hanging in the balance, and the resolution, whatever it might be, would have ripple effects far beyond the walls of the courtroom. As the trial edged closer to its conclusion, the atmosphere inside and outside the courtroom grew heavier with each passing day. Every corner of the community seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for what felt like an inevitable eruption. The prosecutor's final witnesses took the stand, and their testimonies were the kind that didn't just demand attention, they gripped it. One by one, they laid bare the moments that had led up to the officer's fateful decision, offering details that were as haunting as they were eye-opening. One of the most striking testimonies came from a fellow officer who had been present that day. His reluctance was clear, his words were slow and measured, as if he was fighting an internal battle with every sentence. He admitted that, in the moment, he had wanted to intervene, to stop his colleague before things spiraled out of control. But fear held him back, not fear of physical harm, but fear of the unspoken code among officers, the one that discourages questioning a fellow cop in public. "I failed that day," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "I didn't stop him when I should have, and for that I'm sorry." The courtroom was silent as his words hung in the air, a confession that felt as damning as it was human. The prosecution then revealed something that no one in the room had been prepared for. They played audio recordings from the officer's radio communications on the day of the funeral. The recordings were crackling but clear enough to hear the tone of his voice, calm, even smug, as he reported a potential threat at the funeral. But there was no urgency in his tone, no indication that he truly believed there was danger. Instead, his words seemed calculated, as though he was building a narrative to justify his actions before they even happened. The audio ended, and the prosecutor turned to the jury, her voice steady but sharp. "This was not a mistake," she said. "This was not a man acting under pressure. This was a man who knew exactly what he was doing." The defense scrambled to regain control, but their arguments were losing traction. They attempted to paint the officer as a scapegoat, someone being unfairly vilified in a politically charged climate. They questioned the credibility of witnesses, suggesting that their memories might have been clouded by the chaos of the moment. But it was clear that the tide had turned. The evidence was too strong, the voices of the victims too powerful to be ignored. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the crowd had swelled to its largest size yet. People from all walks of life had come together, holding signs, chanting, and standing in solidarity with the general's family. There was a sense of unity, but also an undercurrent of tension. Some feared that the verdict, whatever it might be, could ignite even more conflict. Others worried about what it would mean if justice wasn't served, if the system once again failed to hold someone in power accountable. Inside the courthouse, the general's son sat stoically, his presence commanding but quiet. He had become a beacon for so many, a symbol of resilience and dignity in the face of unimaginable pain. Yet even he couldn't hide the toll the trial was taking. His eyes, though steady, carried the weight of sleepless nights and the burden of representing not just his family, but a larger fight for justice. His mother sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a silent show of support that spoke volumes. As the trial neared its final days, the prosecution delivered their closing arguments. They recounted every piece of evidence, every testimony, every detail that painted a picture of not just one man's actions, but a system that had allowed those actions to go unchecked for so long. "This isn't just about what happened at that funeral," the prosecutor said, her voice rising with emotion. "It's about every warning that was ignored, every complaint that was dismissed, every moment when someone could have stopped this but didn't. And now we're here, asking you to do what so many others failed to do, hold him accountable." The defense, in their final argument, appealed to the jury's sense of doubt. They urged them to consider the possibility that the officer had acted in good faith, that his intentions, though flawed, were not malicious. "We ask you to look at the bigger picture," the defense attorney said, pacing the courtroom. "Don't let emotion cloud your judgment. Remember, a man's life is on the line here." The jury's faces were unreadable, their expressions giving no hint as to what they might be thinking. But as they filed out of the courtroom to begin deliberations, the tension in the room reached a boiling point. Everyone knew that this decision was more than just about one man's fate. It was about sending a message, about drawing a line in the sand that said enough was enough. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the weight of it all was almost unbearable. Outside, the crowd had grown restless. Rumors swirled about how long the jury might take to reach a verdict. Some said it could be hours, others days, but no one was willing to leave, not when they were so close to an answer. The general's family, now surrounded by supporters and reporters, remained composed but visibly exhausted. They had carried this fight for so long, and now all they could do was wait. As the hours stretched on, the tension only grew. The world outside the courthouse seemed to hold its breath, every second feeling like an eternity. Inside, the jury was locked in deliberation, their voices muffled but occasionally audible as they debated the evidence. It was a process that couldn't be rushed, and yet everyone watching felt the urgency, the need for resolution. And then, after what felt like an eternity, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom doors were opened, and people rushed back to their seats, the air thick with anticipation. The officer sat rigid at the defense table, his face still unreadable. The general's family held hands, their expressions a mix of hope and dread. The judge entered, the room fell silent, and the jury filed back in. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the climax of a story that had captivated and shaken an entire community. The foreperson stood, holding the slip of paper that contained the jury's decision. The silence was deafening, the tension so thick it felt like time itself had paused. The judge asked the question, and the foreperson began to read. Every eye in the room was locked on them, every ear straining to hear the words that would decide the officer's fate. This was it, the moment of truth, and just as the verdict was about to be revealed, the screen fades to black, leaving you on the edge of your seat, waiting for what comes next. The courtroom was frozen in time, every soul bracing for the words that would either bring resolution or ignite a deeper fire. The foreperson unfolded the paper and opened their mouth to speak, but before a single syllable could be uttered, a commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. Gasps rippled through the crowd as a man stood up, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Wait, this isn't the full truth," he shouted, his hand trembling as he held up a folder stuffed with papers. The bailiffs moved quickly, but the man didn't resist. He simply handed over the documents, his face pale but determined. "You need to see this. It changes everything." The courtroom buzzed with confusion and speculation as the judge called for order. The jury, already holding the weight of their decision, exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to make of the sudden interruption. The general's family sat in stunned silence, their hands still clasped together. The officer's defense team seized on the moment, their voices rising in protest, demanding to know why the proceedings were being disrupted. But the judge, wary of the gravity of the situation, motioned for the documents to be brought forward. As the clerk approached the bench, the room fell silent again, the tension even thicker than before. What followed was a painstaking few minutes as the judge reviewed the contents of the folder. Each page seemed to carry an unbearable weight as the judge's expression shifted from curiosity to something much darker, disbelief, perhaps even anger. Finally, the judge looked up, their voice measured but sharp. "The court will take a brief recess to examine this new information," they announced. And just like that, the trial was thrown into chaos. As everyone filed out of the courtroom, the whispers and murmurs grew louder. The general's son, still visibly shaken by the disruption, turned to his mother. "What could possibly be in there?" he asked, his voice low but laced with urgency. She didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the door through which the judge had disappeared. Meanwhile, the officer sat at his table, his expression finally betraying a flicker of unease. He leaned in to whisper to his attorney, but whatever was said was drowned out by the noise of the crowd. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Reporters scrambled to update their stories, and the crowd of protesters grew restless, their chants momentarily replaced by questions. Who was the man who had interrupted the trial? And what could he possibly have brought forward at such a critical moment? Speculation ran wild, with some suggesting it was new evidence against the officer and others fearing it might derail the entire case. The break stretched longer than anyone had anticipated, and with it, the anxiety grew. The general's son paced back and forth in the hallway, his mind racing. Had this stranger just complicated the fight for justice, or was this the piece they didn't know they needed? His mother placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "Whatever it is, we're ready," she said softly, though even she didn't seem fully convinced. When the court finally reconvened, the atmosphere was even more charged than before. The judge addressed the room, their tone grave. "The documents submitted contain information that this court cannot ignore," they began. "However, their contents raise additional questions that must be addressed before we can proceed to a verdict." The crowd held its collective breath as the judge continued. It appears that these records point to a larger pattern within the department, one that implicates not just the defendant, but potentially others in positions of authority. The courtroom exploded in gasps and murmurs, the shock palpable. The prosecutor's face was a mixture of surprise and determination, while the defense team scrambled to review the newly introduced evidence. The general's son leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. What had started as a case against one officer was now spiraling into something far bigger. The judge called the man who had interrupted the trial to the stand. He introduced himself as a former investigator for the police department, someone who had worked quietly behind the scenes before being pushed out for asking too many questions. His testimony was like a bombshell, each revelation hitting harder than the last. He explained how he had spent years uncovering a culture of cover-ups, where complaints against officers were buried, and those who spoke out were silenced. This officer wasn't acting alone, he said, his voice steady despite the enormity of his words. There were people above him who enabled this behavior, who allowed it to flourish because it protected their power. The general's family sat frozen, their fight for justice suddenly feeling much larger than they had imagined. The officer, for the first time, seemed genuinely rattled, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. The jury looked overwhelmed, the decision now tangled in layers of complexity they hadn't anticipated. The prosecutor seized the moment, requesting time to investigate the new evidence further. If this information is accurate, they argued, it's not just this officer who needs to be held accountable. The entire system that protected him must face scrutiny. The defense, on the other hand, pushed back hard, calling the new evidence a distraction designed to unfairly sway the jury. But the judge, after careful consideration, ruled in favor of a temporary pause, giving both sides time to delve deeper into the revelations. As the courtroom emptied once again, the general's son turned to his mother, his voice shaking. This was never just about him, was it? She shook her head slowly, her expression unreadable. No, she said after a moment, it never is. The disruption had thrown everything into disarray, but it had also raised the stakes to an unimaginable level. What had started as a trial against one officer had now become a battle to expose a corrupt system. Outside, the crowd buzzed with renewed energy. The protesters, once divided on the specifics of the case, now found common ground in the broader implications of what had been revealed. But with that unity came an undercurrent of fear. If the system was as broken as it seemed, could justice truly be served? Or would the new revelations only lead to more cover-ups, more delays, and more heartache? The officer, now visibly shaken, retreated to a corner of the defense table as his attorney spoke rapidly to him. For the first time, the power he had once wielded so freely seemed to be slipping away. And yet, even with the walls closing in, there was something in his eyes, a flicker of defiance, as though he still believed he might escape the consequences of his actions. As the day drew to a close, the weight of what had unfolded hung heavy over everyone involved. The general's family returned home, their minds racing with unanswered questions and newfound determination. The jury, dismissed for the evening, struggled to process the shocking turn of events, and the world outside waited anxiously, knowing that the trial had just transformed into something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. The stakes had never been higher, and the resolution, whatever it might be, promised to shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew. But the truth, as they were all beginning to realize, was far more complicated than they had ever anticipated, and the fight for justice was only just beginning. The courtroom was packed once again as the trial resumed, the tension nearly unbearable. The new evidence had turned the case into something far more complex, and the stakes had never been higher. The prosecution presented their findings after days of reviewing the documents submitted by the former investigator. What they revealed was more explosive than anyone had anticipated. The officer on trial wasn't just a rogue actor. He was part of a coordinated effort within the department to target specific individuals, often under the guise of maintaining public safety. The general's presence at the funeral had triggered a pre-planned response, one that was rooted not in fear or misunderstanding, but in deliberate profiling. The prosecutor laid it out methodically, connecting dots that painted a harrowing picture. Internal emails and memos showed that the officer had been briefed about the funeral days in advance, warned about the high-profile attendees expected to be there. The narrative of a potential threat wasn't something the officer had come up with in the moment. It was fed to him by higher-ups, a script designed to justify excessive measures if needed. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as this new reality unfolded. The defense attempted to discredit the documents, calling them circumstantial, but it was clear they were grasping at straws. The jury's faces were grim as they absorbed the depth of the corruption revealed. The general's son sat motionless, his hands clenched into fists. For so long, the family had been focused on holding one man accountable, but now they saw how deep the problem went. His mother whispered something to him, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "This isn't just about your father anymore," she said. "It's about everyone who has ever been wronged by this system." The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the judge called for closing arguments. The prosecution, armed with this new evidence, spoke with a fiery conviction. "This is no longer about one man's mistake," the prosecutor declared, her voice echoing through the room. "This is about a system that prioritizes power over justice, that sees accountability as optional. And now we have the opportunity to do what so many others have failed to do, demand the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be." The defense, though visibly shaken, made one final attempt to sow doubt. They argued that the officer was being unfairly scapegoated, a lone figure taking the fall for a much larger problem. "If there's corruption in the system," the defense attorney said, "then shouldn't we focus on that instead of destroying this one man's life?" But the argument rang hollow, the weight of the evidence too overwhelming to ignore. Finally, it was time for the jury to deliberate. The room emptied out and the wait began again. Hours turned into a day, and the tension only grew. The general's family stayed close, their resolve unwavering despite the emotional toll. The crowd outside the courthouse swelled once more, their chants growing louder as they demanded justice, not just for the general, but for everyone who had been wronged by the system. When the jury finally returned, the room was electric with anticipation. The four-person stood, holding the verdict that would decide not just the officer's fate, but the future of the fight for accountability. The judge asked the question, and the four-person's voice rang out clear and steady. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted. Relief, anger, and vindication all collided as the decision reverberated through the room. The general's son exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his mother squeezing his hand tightly. The officer sat motionless, the weight of the verdict finally breaking through his stoic facade. But just as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence, a voice interrupted once again. It was the former investigator, the man who had first disrupted the trial. He stood and asked to address the court one last time. "There's something you all need to know," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "The documents I provided weren't the only ones I found. There's more, evidence that implicates individuals far higher up than anyone here has dared to imagine." The room fell into stunned silence. Even the judge seemed momentarily speechless before regaining composure. "This is highly irregular," the judge said, but the investigator pressed on. The officer on trial was following orders. Those orders came from people who are still in power, people who will continue to protect themselves unless we bring everything into the light. The general's family exchanged a look, their victory suddenly feeling incomplete. The prosecutor, too, seemed caught off guard but quickly adjusted. "If what you're saying is true," she said, "then this fight is far from over." The judge, after a brief consultation with both legal teams, agreed to allow the investigator to submit the additional evidence. The officer, now visibly shaken, turned to his attorney, his whispered words barely audible. "I'm not going down alone," he said. It was a chilling statement, one that hinted at the storm still to come. The trial concluded with the officer being sentenced to life in prison, a decision that brought some measure of closure, but left many questions unanswered. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers, but the celebration was tempered by the weight of the new revelations. The general's son stood before the microphones, his voice steady but his words heavy with purpose. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's just the beginning. We've uncovered one piece of the puzzle, but there's so much more to be done." As the family left the courthouse, the former investigator approached them, his face wary but determined. "I'll help you," he said simply. "If you're ready to take this further, I'll make sure you have everything you need." The son looked at his mother, her nod giving him the strength to respond. "We're ready," he said. And with those words, the fight for justice expanded beyond what anyone had imagined. The story didn't end there. What started as a trial for one officer had become a catalyst for uncovering a system deeply rooted in corruption. The officer's conviction was just the first step in a battle that promised to expose the truth, no matter how far up the chain it went. For the general's family and everyone who had stood with them, the road ahead would be long and uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, there was hope, a glimmer of light in the darkness, a promise that justice, though delayed, was still possible. As the sun began to set on the courthouse steps, the crowd lingered, reluctant to leave despite the trial's conclusion. For many, the conviction was a victory worth celebrating, but it wasn't the closure they had hoped for. The revelation of deeper corruption had opened a door that couldn't be closed, leaving a sense of unease mixed with cautious optimism. The general's family stood together, taking in the energy of the crowd, their exhaustion apparent but overshadowed by a renewed sense of purpose. The general's son addressed the gathering one last time, his voice carrying over the murmurs of reporters and supporters. "Today, we took a step forward," he began, his tone steady but reflective. "But the truth is, this isn't just about my father, or even this trial. It's about a system that has failed so many for so long. We're not stopping here. We owe it to everyone who has been silenced, ignored, or harmed by this broken system to keep fighting." He had left behind. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the trial rippled across the country. The prosecution, emboldened by the new evidence, launched a broader investigation into the police department and the chain of command that had allowed such behavior to thrive. Subpoenas were issued, whistleblowers came forward, and a wave of accountability began to sweep through the ranks. The former investigator who had risked everything to expose the truth became a key figure in the ongoing probe, his knowledge and documents providing a roadmap for uncovering the extent of the corruption. The officer who had been convicted remained defiant at first, refusing to cooperate even as his name became synonymous with abuse of power. But as the walls closed in, his resolve began to crack. Faced with the possibility of additional charges stemming from the broader investigation, he finally agreed to testify in exchange for some leniency. What he revealed was shocking, even to those who had suspected the worst. He named names, detailed meetings, and provided evidence of policies designed to target vulnerable communities under the guise of maintaining order. His testimony painted a chilling picture of a system not just flawed, but actively harmful, fueled by prejudice and a culture of impunity. For the general's family, the revelations were both validating and heartbreaking. They had always known their fight was bigger than just one man, but hearing the extent of the injustice still hit hard. It's hard to celebrate when you realize how much pain it took to get here, the general's son admitted during an interview. But if this means no one else has to go through what we did, then it's worth it. The community rallied around the family, their determination fueling a broader movement for reform. Activists and organizations joined forces, pushing for policy changes and greater oversight of law enforcement. Protests turned into town hall meetings, and social media campaigns sparked conversations that reached far beyond the local level. The general's name became a symbol of resilience and the fight for justice, his story inspiring countless others to stand up and demand change. Over time, real progress began to take shape. Several high-ranking officials were forced to resign or face charges as a result of the investigation, and new leadership was brought in to overhaul the department. Policies were rewritten, training programs revamped, and independent oversight committees established to ensure accountability. It wasn't a perfect solution, change rarely is, but it was a start, a step toward rebuilding trust and creating a system that truly served the people. The general's family remained deeply involved in the efforts, using their platform to advocate for continued reform. His mother, once hesitant to speak publicly, became a powerful voice in the movement, her quiet strength resonating with those who had suffered in silence. "I didn't ask to be part of this fight," she said during one event, "but I won't walk away from it now. My husband believed in justice, and I'll honor him by making sure that belief doesn't die with him." As to the general's son, he took on an active role in organizing and connecting with other families who had experienced similar losses. Through his efforts, a network of support and advocacy grew, giving a voice to those who had been overlooked for far too long. Though the pain of losing his father never fully faded, he found purpose in the fight, channeling his grief into something meaningful. Years later, on the anniversary of the trial's conclusion, the family gathered at a memorial erected in the general's honor. It wasn't just a tribute to him, but to everyone who had fought and continued to fight for justice. The crowd that gathered there wasn't as large as the one outside the courthouse all those years ago, but the spirit was the same. People shared stories, celebrated progress, and recommitted themselves to the work that still lay ahead. The general's mother stood at the memorial, her hand resting on the plaque that bore her husband's name. "He always said that justice wasn't about revenge or punishment," she said softly, her voice carrying over the hushed crowd. "It's about healing. It's about making things right, not just for one person but for everyone. That's what we're still working toward." As the family walked away from the memorial, the general's son glanced back, taking in the sight of people coming together, united by a shared purpose. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. The fight wasn't over, but they had come so far, and he knew his father would have been proud. The story didn't end with a single trial or conviction. It didn't end with one movement or one reform.